For our listeners, this is a content warning. Throughout this podcast, we touch on subjects related to trauma, misogyny, racism and medical racism, sexual misconduct, residential schools, as well as many aspects of death and dying. Should you need them, there is a list of resources in our show notes. Most importantly, as you listen, take a break when you need to, and please take care of yourselves. We'd like to acknowledge that this podcast is produced and recorded across the land known as Canada. These traditional and treaty territories are full of rich Indigenous histories, home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We embrace the opportunity to share this story in a respectful, inclusive, and culturally appropriate way.
I'm Danielle Wilson-Brown. This podcast is about my mom, Marion Brown. She is a visionary, perpetual student, the biggest nerd, and adventure seeker. She is in a one-life stand with my dad, Fred. She is a mother of 3 and new grandmother of 2 beautiful grandbabies. She is a TV and film producer, former musician, family therapist, governance consultant, and soon-to-be ex-council member of Gitlafa Nation in BC. Oh, and by the way, she also has pulmonary hypertension. There is no cure, and it will take her life. And so, we're going to share our story and this end-of-life journey with you. I hope you'll join me, Danielle Wilson-Brown, my mom, and some special guests as we begin to discuss death, dying, and above all, living. Welcome to Before I Go. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Before I Go. Before we jump into today's episode, I just want to thank our listeners. I really want to tell you how much I appreciate you walking this journey with us. Your support has been unbelievable. And I just want to thank you so much for joining my mom and I on this journey. How are you doing today, Mom?
I have to say that it becomes more and more evident what a sacred journey, what a sacred project this is. And I appreciate everybody who's participated in it, who's listened to it, who's walked with us on this journey, because it's incredibly powerful. These are conversations that we need to have. I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed by the whole thing. The people who have reached out to us, who've taken the time to listen to us, to share this journey is incredibly powerful. And I am truly humbled by it. I am grateful. I'm grateful for this. I am at peace. And thank you.
It's been a heavy week. And I think this will tie into our conversation today. And I've mentioned in previous episodes that what I'm feeling is grief. My aunt, it was her birthday last week. She died of pulmonary hypertension. And on her birthday, she would have been 65. And like I've mentioned before, grief is not linear. It's a cycle we continue to go throughout our lives. I was angry. I was angry at this illness that took my aunt from me. And I just want to honor all of those emotions that come up. I think, like we've told our listeners before, self-care is mandatory. And so that's what I'm sitting with this week, honoring that grief. Because the love I had for my aunt, this is the price we pay. That sense of loss. So as much as it's heavy on my heart and my soul, I am still grateful to be part of this journey. And I want to thank our very special guest today for joining us. Myrna McCallum. She is a lawyer, a teacher, an author, and a podcast host in her own right. Hi, Myrna.
Hi.
Can you introduce yourself and where you're coming from?
Yes, I am coming in from Tsleil-Waututh territory, the ancestral unceded traditional territory of Tsleil-Waututh people. I am grateful to live and work on their lands here on the North Shore in Vancouver. But I am Cree, I am Métis, I'm from Treaty 6 territory in northern Saskatchewan. That is my home, my original home. This is my home now. And yeah, I'm a cookum. That's probably my claim to fame is I'm a grandmother of 3. And I'm just really happy to be here with the two of you today to have this really important conversation.
I was just hoping you can tell us a bit about your background and where you grew up.
Oh my gosh. I wish I could say it's a happy background. um, what can I say? I was born to a 15-year-old girl. My mother was an Indian hospital survivor. She had tuberculosis when she was 7 years old, and she went to an Indian hospital in southern Saskatchewan, which at the time was like several hours away from our community. She was there until she was 12. And we now know through like class actions and the stories that people are telling that the experiences of Indigenous kids in Indian hospitals was very similar to what Indigenous kids experienced in residential schools. So my mom had a lot of trauma. She was also born to my grandmother, Agnes, who was from a neighboring reserve to my community's Green Lake. It's a Métis village. But next door is a First Nations community, Waterhen Lake First Nation, which is where my grandmother was from. She was an Indian residential school survivor. She had what I presume to be a horrible time at residential school because that was evidenced sort of by how she lived her life. And she ultimately died of a combination of alcoholism and diabetes at 52. Yeah, my mom had a lot of trauma, and that was also evidenced by a lot of decisions she made. And as a result of her decision making, my brother and I also went to residential school. We went to La Brette Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan. And yeah, it was a childhood full of a lot of violence and a lot of neglect and abuse of all sorts. It was very difficult, but that is kind of how trauma works, isn't it? It kind of trickles down like that. And I would say in many respects, I'm now a cycle breaker, but even more so, my daughters are, my son is. And I would say the reality and the lived experience that my grandchildren are going to have, it will be like night and day compared to what I endured and what my mother endured and what my grandmother endured. And so it's kind of hard to like just talk a little bit about where I come from without mentioning my mother and my grandmother and on and on. And I know that the two of you totally understand that because we are really the people we come from. That's really what I could tell you about that experience.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. I mean, that's what this podcast has been about, is about having these kind of conversations, because we've heard the conversations, we've heard the comments about residential school denialism, we've heard the comments about Indian hospitals, and we've heard the term intergenerational trauma. And they think that's a thing of the past, but it's not. One of the questions we always ask is, through all of that trauma, how do we maintain hope? And conversations with you and my mom, I see how much joy and love it brings you to talk about your grandkids. And if that's what it takes, oh, I'm so happy about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I want to say, if we're being honest, we're all really familiar with a lot of the horror stories and the tragedies of our lived history. And I wish I could just say, I turned a corner and everything became really awesome and wonderful. And like, it's all sunshine and rainbows. And it's really like, it's not, I have to say, it's a constant battle. It's a constant fight to choose the road less traveled. Like, I don't know how the two of you feel about that. I'd like to hear how you feel about that. But I know for me, my mom died at 59 pretty suddenly. Like, her heart just stopped. And that totally makes sense given the state of her life. My brother died last year of a fentanyl overdose. I would say he never survived residential school. Like, if we call survival living on the downtown east side, your whole life and becoming drug addicted and alcoholic. I don't know that that's survival. And so I'm kind of like the last one left standing in my family. And I've got to say, it feels really heavy. It feels like a heavy responsibility to keep going, moving forward, looking for the light, trying to be in the light. When, for me at least, I feel like the darkness is always there and it's always calling. And so every day it has to be a choice to like choose hope.
The burden that you carry as the descendant of somebody who went to an Indian hospital, as somebody who went to a residential school, is just as heavy a burden as it is as if you went yourself. Myrna, I want to hold my hands up to you with everything that you went through and everything that you shared with us. But that's a shared experience with so many of us. If people understood what so many people suffer in their daily lives, or the burdens that they carry, then there might be a little more understanding. I love the work that you're doing. How do you have a trauma-informed organization? How do you create that?
It's really challenging, I have to say. And I want to say thank you for those words and thank you for just seeing me. I think that means so much. And the message you're sending is so right. Like, we don't know the burdens people carry. We have no idea what it took for them to be who they are and where they are. And I think if more of us took the time to think about that, we'd probably have a different world right now. And this whole bit around, trauma, being the trauma-informed lawyer, right? That's the name of my podcast. And, it wasn't really intended for me to create kind of a living out of talking about trauma because I'm a lawyer, right? Like I was a prosecutor, I was a defense lawyer, I was an adjudicator. I've always been a lawyer. That's all I wanted to do. But what I found was a couple of things through my practice was predominantly I served Indigenous communities. So what I saw was so much trauma in the courtroom. And then I saw judges and lawyers and police officers. I witnessed the way they treated Indigenous people, like my people, our people. And I just thought, like, if they had even like an ounce of compassion or empathy, would they treat my people like that? And I think probably not, right? Because like you said, after a while you're in this thing and you start to lose sight of the humanity in other people because you, I think, become stressed out, you become burnt out, you become exhausted, and you're not addressing your own needs, but you keep showing up to do the work, even though you're overwhelmed and overextended. And I think what happens when we continue to work from that state, we lose sight of the humanity in others, but we also lose sight of our own humanity. So when you are not willing to see humanity in other people, or you're not willing to feel your own humanity, I think what tends to happen is like you lose all the good stuff. Like you lose your compassion, you lose your empathy, you lose your patience, you just lose sight of why you are there to begin with. When I was adjudicating Indian residential school claims, and that meant like listening to hundreds of survivors tell me what they experienced, which was really hard, probably the hardest job I did because I went to residential school and so did my brother and my grandmother and others, so many others. And these stories were really personal. Some of them I could identify with. And that job, I would say, pretty well like broke me down, because you can only hear so many stories of the not just the legalized kidnapping of Indigenous children, because I worked with a lot of elders who lived through that time where, the police would come in on a float plane, just scoop these kids up off the beach and take them away. Um, they would show up with, in cars with like members of the clergy, just like push all these kids in the car and take them away. So it wasn't just being taken that I'd hear those stories of. It would be like the cutting of the hair. It would be the first incident of sexual assault, the first incident of physical assault, the first incident of being confined or degraded or humiliated, or like the stories just got worse and worse and worse. And I would think, oh, it can't get worse than what I just heard. And then I would sit in another hearing, and then I would hear an even worse story of the ways in which children were treated by members of like the church. And the trauma that surfaced in that experience in me and in others really is the thing that compelled me to step away from work, because I was ready to die, honestly. Like I just didn't even want to live anymore. And it was probably one of the darkest periods of my life, was coming out of that. And fortunately, I found a good therapist, and I was able to move through that and then think about like, how can I use this experience to educate people on trauma, and how we do better, and how we can do better, and how we can actually take care of ourselves and reconnect with our own humanity, so that we treat people in a good way. Because I'm of the belief that if you are in good relationship with yourself, that's going to kind of ripple out, and the way in which you treat people is going to come from that place. But if you have nothing to give and you keep showing up, that's going to be reflected in how you treat people, and the quality of your relationships will tell you so much about like who you are and where you're at in life, and the quality of your own relationship with yourself. Right. And so this is now what I just educate people on. And I have to say to the two of you, like I really believe it's creator given. Like I couldn't have dreamed this up. I believe that my good ancestors and the creator work through my voice. And I'm constantly inspired by the stories of Indigenous people who have survived horrible things. They are really my teachers, my original teachers. They taught me what law school never did. And that is what I promote now everywhere I go.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. Talking about mental health, after hearing all of the trauma of residential school survivors or anybody in your law practice, you talk about therapy, but how did you hold on? How did you get through that?
Before we get to that, can I just let you know that we're producing a documentary on residential school survivors, and my God, what I've heard so far, it's pretty much after every day of shooting, I have to take a couple of weeks off just to rebuild myself. And then, okay, we go into another day, and you hear these stories that just break your heart, and you lose faith in humanity, and you get angry, and you get sad. And it's like, my God, how could they allow this to happen to our people time and time again? And then you have the denialists who say no. Or why don't you just get over it now? I just want to acknowledge that dark place you went to after, the strength that it takes to come out of that. And then how did you take it and use it to propel yourself to do this work that you're doing? So sorry, Danielle, I just had to acknowledge that I heard what she said.
Yeah. I mean, it was the toughest job of my life to do that. And I mean, I won't get into the stories that I heard because they were devastating. And I don't want to devastate other people. I was devastated by what I heard. Everyone in that room was devastated. Yes. So one of the ways in which I come through that, and I didn't come through it well. Like, I went through such a dark place. I was in a very dark place for a long time after I left that work. And I really didn't know that if I was going to survive. One thing that helps me now to choose to survive, and like I said, it has to be a choice. Like, I have to choose, is gratitude. Like you said, Marion, being like, what am I grateful for? And sometimes it's, sometimes my defaults don't always work for me. Like, okay, I'm grateful that I have my legs. I'm grateful that I'm healthy. I'm grateful that I have my grandkids. Like, but I'm not always feeling it. I feel like I just say it until, like, hopefully I start to believe it. But like, I will just keep going through the list. I'm grateful the sun is shining. I'll just oh, I'm grateful that there's a pen nearby. Like, I'm just looking for something to desperately feel the gratitude because I don't always feel it. So I work on that, but I've got to say, like, it's so hard to choose to survive. I'm like, just a trigger warning. I'm going to just say, the first time I attempted suicide, I was 6 years old. And for me, that has been a crossroads I've come to many times in my life. And I still keep coming back to it where I'm like, do I still want to live? Do I still want to live? And sometimes the answer is no, I do not. And then I have to look for reasons to just stay. Because ultimately we're all going to go. And I feel like such a heavy responsibility to survive, because what a shitty legacy it would be if I did all that I did and at the end of the day I chose to check out. Like, that's a heavy thing to leave my children and my grandchildren with, and anybody who tells me what an inspiration I am. Yeah, it's a constant battle to just choose life for as long as we're here, because it's such a gift to be grateful for. But I say this and I'm open about it because I know I'm not the only one. I know that so many of us battle darkness all the time and have to actively choose to live. And sometimes it's every day. Sometimes it's every other month. Sometimes it's like once a year. And it really just depends on like what's going on externally and internally, in terms of the frequency. But what I know is it's constant. And sometimes, when I learn about epigenetics and I learn about intergenerational trauma and cultural legacies and cultural burdens, I have to say sometimes I'm not sure. Like, I don't even know if this like desire to die sometimes comes from me. Does it come from me or does it come through me? Is that something my grandmother lived with? Was that something my mother lived with? Was it something my great-grandmother lived with? And it trickles down, because what we know about epigenetics is we don't necessarily need to have the direct lived experience of the people who've come, but we will feel the impact. So I often wonder how much of what I feel sometimes is not mine. It's just something I have inherited, and it's something I need to heal and process. Does that make sense?
Wow. That does make sense.
That's powerful.
I've actually never thought of it in that way before. But, I've actually done a lot of study on epigenetics, but I've never really connected it in the way you have. Thank you for sharing. I mean, the suicidal thoughts, sadly, you're right. Many of us shared that experience and continue to battle that.
I'm Danielle Wilson Brown, and this is Before I Go, a podcast where my mom, Marion Brown, and I have some of the most profound conversations of our lives about her end-of-life journey.
I'm a firm believer in therapy of whatever mode that you use. It's important because part of what we do talk about in this podcast is self-care. And one of the things is that, there are no good or bad emotions. But I, for one, I'm extremely grateful that you battled these and you're winning and you're choosing ways to change the world that we live in, even if we just change our own little corner. And so when I was younger, I wanted to go and save the world. But now I'm just happy to save myself and my family. Maybe we do feel the grief of our grandmothers. Maybe we do feel the pain of them. And maybe we do that so our grandchildren don't.
I think it does. Like when I heard Eduardo Duran is this Lakota psychotherapist, maybe I think, and he operates in Billings, Montana. He wrote a book called Healing the Soul Wound, and he calls intergenerational trauma the soul wound. And he says that like whenever we take steps to heal ourselves, we're not just healing for 7 generations ahead, we're healing for 7 generations behind us. So like he believes, and I think this is probably an Indigenous worldview, that when we heal, we can heal all the stuff that our ancestors could not. And then when we look at epigenetics and we look at somebody like Mark Wolin wrote this book called It Didn't Start With You, it totally makes sense because like if we are made of the cells of the people we come from, like my mother's eyes and all of these things, well, why wouldn't I carry her pain? And if I'm healing myself, then I'm also healing her pain. I'm healing what she couldn't. And this is something I think about a lot. And, Eduardo Duran will say healing is the only imperative. Healing is the only, and I almost say that to myself a lot, like a mantra. Healing is the only imperative. So even though I can get caught up in the bullshit of everyday life, whatever it's the traffic or a thing didn't go my way or I didn't get whatever it was, I just always keep coming back to healing is the only imperative. Healing is the only imperative. And sometimes if staying alive every day and choosing life and choosing gratitude or just choosing whatever it is that I'm choosing, like, then that's a lot. But I really believe that every time we break down a barrier or heal a little bit or overcome a trigger or resolve a thing, we're doing it for all the people who couldn't before us.
This conversation is incredibly powerful. I mean, talking about all of, we're trying to get rid of that stigma, right? Of dealing with it, of dealing with the consequences of intergenerational trauma, and I agree with you. Every day is a choice. We've said many times, self-care is mandatory, but what does that actually look like? Well, for me, every day starts with the question, how am I going to show up for myself today? And it has to be at least one thing in one category of like, what's one good thing you're going to do for yourself spiritually or physically or mentally or emotionally? Because that choice, that conscious choice, showing up for yourself and how am I going to take care of myself today? That sense of accountability, it's so small and it's so short, but it builds this pattern of healing.
I talked about in a previous episode about the first, in many respects, we're the first to go to university or to graduate with a master's degree, or the first to, the first to go to treatment or the first to go to therapy. And there's a burden that comes with that too. And it's difficult to come from communities such as ours because we struggle and we pull ourselves out. But there are countless people who could do with your help, your financial help, your just any way that you can assist others. And so I can't imagine that how it looks in your own family. And I'm hoping that at some point somebody offered you compassion, Myrna.
I mean, for sure. I mean, I don't know how do you survive childhood? Like somebody must have loved me at some point, and cared for me at some point. I was in and out of care for a number of years. And I remember being in a couple households where I was like loved. I mean, I was there always for a short time, but maybe it was just enough to help me through, like to move me forward. Elders were really instrumental in my life when I had them, but oftentimes I met them close to the end of their time. I mean, I shared what I shared because I know I'm not the only one. And where you see like and I use air quotes, successful person, like it's not always what it appears to be. When you have like a history of trauma, like direct and intergenerational, that person is like every day having to make a choice to do what they do, to stay in the light, to stay on the path, however you want to call it. And so I share this because too often I think our people look at what they deem successful people and go, oh my God, that person has it all figured out. Like, I wish I could be them. And I'm here to say, no, we don't have it all figured out. And every day it's a battle and every day it's a choice. I don't know anyone who's fully healed, who's like, oh my God, I figured this out and here's the formula. And if you ever hear anyone go, I figured it out and here's the formula, I'd call bullshit on that. It's a lifelong kind of thing. It's kind of like the way I see it is it's a relay. I'm going to take it as far as I can in my lifetime. Hopefully my children take it a little further. Hopefully my grandchildren take it even further. But I just don't think it's anything but a relay race, And so my responsibility is to take it as far as I can take it to anyone who's listening, who is feeling the weight of the world or feeling like you carry all the pain of your people. Find a way to like shake it off, like let it go, whether it's through your voice or it's through your body or it's through working out and sweating it out or it's through going to a rage room and screaming and crying and wailing and pounding on old sofa or whatever it is. It has to go somewhere because if it doesn't move, it will stay with you.
I'm a very strong believer in our perspective is our reality. And one of the hardest things we ever have to do is shift our perspective. And we've had a similar thing, but it's a different analogy, but where each generation pushes the other one up. My mom, her siblings, were some of the first to all graduate high school and go on to college and university. What made you choose law?
I wish I could say because I wanted to help people. That's not true. I had like a traumatic childhood, right? And so I was deep in fight and flight mode, all those trauma responses that you still see them, right? Especially in a lot of our youth. So that was me. I was a very angry young person. And I was watching TV one night. I was just noticing it was some kind of law show. And I was noticing like lawyers were so cutthroat, so calculated, so like unfeeling. And I was like, oh, I think those are my people. Like, how do I get to become one of those people? Because if I looked around my community, like people who were going to school were becoming like teachers and social workers and like, hats off to those folks. Those are important jobs. However, no way in hell was I going to do jobs like that because that meant I had to take care of little people or people's feelings. And I was like, nope. Absolutely not. I don't want to be around anyone's feelings. I can't even sit with my own feelings. So forget that. Profession is like the most unfeeling, uncaring. And I was like, law it's law. Like, it's about problem solving. It's about being analytical. I'm very good at that. And so, yeah, off I went to law school. I wish it was that easy. Honestly, it wasn't. I went to an all-Native high school. I didn't even know that Native people could become lawyers. I never saw a Native lawyer. I had to ask my white teacher, like, is that even possible? And then I got a little bit of an education into like how recent it had been because of the Indian Act that we could actually even go to law school as Indigenous people, right? So fortunately, yeah, I could go to law school, and I wasn't sure it was going to be possible for me because I was already a single parent in high school. I had my first child, who is 33 now. She's about to turn like 34 in a couple days. Yeah, I was in high school and I was a single mom and I was on welfare, and I was like, but can I actually do it? And this teacher said to me, yeah, you can, but it's going to be really tough. It's going to be harder than what it would have been if you didn't have any kids. But I did it. When I went to law school, I had 2 kids at the time, and I loaded them in the backseat of my car and I drove out to Vancouver and I went to UBC. And when I was in law school and when I went to do the bar exam, it totally validated what I thought to be true. Like, never did we talk about the people who brought legal issues. We only talked about legal issues. Facts only, like that was the approach. And I was like, hallelujah, like this is exactly where I am going to shine, because I don't have to deal with feelings and I don't have to really deal with the people. I just have to deal with facts and I have to deal with evidence, and like, this is perfect. Yeah. So I certainly didn't go to law because I was like, oh, I want to help people. No, I was just running away from my own trauma.
We appreciate the honesty because, there's so many stereotypes out there where it's just like, we come from this martyr mentality. How are we going to show up for others? How are we going to be there for others? And you talk about boundaries too. Let's learn to prioritize ourselves. Let's learn to be selfish. Let's learn to have those boundaries set firmly in place.
Totally. Like, if you've always been a yes person and you say yes to everyone around you, you can bet they're not going to like you so much when you start saying no to them.
There was one thing that you said that I want to go back to is you didn't want to talk about what you heard. Because, I had that same concern with doing the documentary on Indian residential schools. And, you don't want to traumatize your audience. But I remember as a child growing up after the Holocaust and seeing bodies pushed into a hole. Yeah, I was traumatized, but I never, ever forgot that. And I didn't lose my humanity in the process. Not sanitizing it, because the crap that happened in those residential schools has to be remembered. I mean, they finally settled the the Indian hospitals class action lawsuit. They really haven't kept people up to date because my dad is part of that lawsuit.
Was it the Indian hospitals or the Indian day school?
The Indian hospitals.
Indian hospitals.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, okay.
And you know what they took off the table? Anything medical. How is that even a thing? Because I heard a lot of the crap that happened in those hospitals. And then when we talk about the structural racism, the things that I've experienced as a pulmonary hypertension patient, some of my rights being taken away. Getting sick. A year ago, I had a very serious blood infection and was given a 50-50 chance of surviving the night. And the doctor had signed a DNR for me, a do not resuscitate. He didn't talk it over with my family. He didn't talk it over with my friends. He signed the damn thing. So if anything happened that night, they would have just let me go. And like you, I got shit to do.
Can I just say, like, what you just shared is fucking outrageous to me. And like, where is the accountability? Where is the accountability? What is it going to take for medical and health practitioners to see Indigenous people as valuable, as critical in their communities, as human beings? Like, what is it going to take? What do you think? What is it going to take to change the reality that Indigenous people experience when they are seeking medical care?
It takes this kind of conversation. It takes a number of our people to become doctors, to become part of that field. It takes our people to step into those spaces in hospitals and administrations. It takes a collective voice of our people. It takes anger. It takes learning about the past. I'd looked after my mother when she was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. And a big part of that was becoming her medical advocate. And with every doctor who came in, I told them why she didn't trust him. I educated as many people as I could.
And we've been working on taking up these spaces in various fields. And I'm always amazed to hear of how many fields we're starting to take over, whether it's education, policy, governance, law, medicine. We'd really love to hear about your experiences in the law field. Education, what did law school look like? What did your law firm look like?
Oh gosh, it's all colonial, right? It's colonial. I mean, but before I tell you about that, I just want to speak to what Marion said. We should never forget in this history, like this Canadian state we live in, we should never forget what residential schools did to our people, what Indian hospitals did to our people. A few months ago, I took my daughters to Europe. We went away for a couple of weeks. And while we were out there, we went to the site of a former concentration camp. We went to the house of Anne Frank. And as I looked at all of that and felt it, like you could breathe the same air, like in the concentration camp, like how there was just no windows and like how cold it was. And they even had like the torture room was still like there intact. I could not go into that room and I would not go into that room. But we walked through like the barracks or like the dorms or whatever. And I thought, why don't we have something like this in Canada? Like there should be a museum that doesn't just hold pictures, but recreates sort of where we slept, where we ate, and also the small little rooms that they confined us in when they were punishing, torturing, the torture, like St. Anne Indian Hospital, St. Anne Residential School had an electric chair. Why not show that? Why not preserve that so that people could see for themselves, these residential school deniers who say that children and babies were not murdered and incinerated in these schools, which I know for a fact is a lie, is the truth. So when they say that that's a lie, like that itself is the biggest lie ever that they tell themselves. I know homicide took place. I know torture of Indigenous children took place. And why don't we have more than just the, whatever it is called in Winnipeg, that Truth and Reconciliation Dialogue Center, whatever it is that they have there, we need more than that. I think we need to have a museum that recreates some of these spaces so that people can see for themselves and that details some of the so-called food that we were fed, the places we were tortured, and the tools that they use to torture Indigenous children. You're right, like these stories, these experiences need to be shared. And one of the reasons why I don't share them is just simply like they're not mine to share. They're not mine to tell. They live in me and they live with me. Honestly, some of them, if I had to reopen all of that and talk about it, I don't know that I would get through the telling of what I've heard. But that said, a lot of these stories were preserved, and a lot of the work that I did in the IAP with the decisions that I wrote and other adjudicators wrote, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission went to court to fight the IAP for those, even though we did those hearings in confidential spaces and we promised the survivors confidentiality. The TRC still went to court to fight for access to those materials. And I believe they got access to a number of those materials. It wouldn't take much to recreate a visual of what that would look like. We need to talk more about it because of the way in which it lives within us, right? Trauma isn't the event. That is what is traumatic. Trauma is the wound that we carry because of the event that we experienced. Trauma is a wound. And so if we're not talking about the ways in which we are wounded and we continue to be wounded and the ways in which our wounds are ripped open, especially around truth and reconciliation, when they call us in as survivors to share our stories with them for the benefit of their education, how dehumanizing is that? And I refuse to ever do that and participate in that because of its dehumanizing nature. And I now want to just pivot to another thing you said, Marianne, about how statistically Indigenous people are not electing MAID. How much of that is because they're not even educated on it? And I think like that is like the root of it all. Like, why is there so much indifference around the Indigenous life? We deserve to die with dignity, to live with dignity. I mean, I'm dealing with that now. My brother died on the downtown east side. Apparently, when he died, the guy he was using with immediately told the first responders, like, he's got a sister. Her name is Myrna McCallum. She's a lawyer from Saskatchewan. Like, you need to go notify her. If anyone does a Google search, immediately, I'm the only person who comes up. And still, the police did not notify me until 4.5 months after he passed, so that by the time I got to go and see him, ID him, he was so decomposed that my daughter and I couldn't even be in a room with him for very long. As a result, like, I couldn't do a proper burial for him either. I had no choice but to get him cremated. The thing that came to mind for me was dignity. Like, did these VPD officers just think, here's a dead Indigenous man, nobody gives a shit, nobody cares? Like, so why bother prioritizing notifying next to kin? Nobody cares about another dead Indian. Like, I wonder what messaging goes through the heads of these police officers that they make the decision to not prioritizing notifying next to kin, and how many Indigenous relatives of ours who are living with the traumas of all that their communities and their people have experienced and are down there and die there. How many of their families have had to wait a long time before even being told that their loved one has passed away?
Myrna, I'd like to ask you to tell us what your brother's name was.
His name was Ty Iron. I used to call him Tire Iron because he would make him laugh. Tire Iron. But yeah, that was his name. I mean, it was the name that he chose for himself. So that is the name that I'm sharing with all of you.
I love that name. Yeah, I know a couple of people who have reinvented themselves with the new name and started taking back their power.
No, and I'm so sorry that you and your family had to endure that injustice, that inhumanity. We need to have these conversations. And one of mom's lessons have always been, we cannot fix what we don't acknowledge. And that's what we want to do here. We want to acknowledge all of the hurt and trauma that still exists, that are still impacting our families, our communities. And I really hope that you'll come back and we can continue this conversation. And before we wrap up, I just want to ask both of you, how are you feeling?
Well, I mean, I'll quickly just say I would love to come back, and I want to say that I'm leaving here feeling, actually, in spite of how honest our conversation has been, I feel really inspired. And I want to say I've listened to some of your episodes, and I promote it on my on Instagram and everywhere, because I think everyone should listen to the two of you.
Oh, thank you so much, Myrna. I am truly inspired by you. I appreciate how vulnerable you are through the telling of these stories. I appreciate the strength that you show and the incredible power that you have. So thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your stories with us.
Thank you.
Danielle, how are you?
Like you, I'm feeling all of the feels. I'm going to honor the grief of myself, my family, and all of the families who are impacted. And I can't wait for part 2 where we get to continue this conversation. So as always, to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us. And self-care is not a choice. It's mandatory. Figure out how to take care of yourself.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope our conversations provided a unique perspective, opened the door to your own discussions, and offer some comfort. If you have any questions or would like to learn more about anything we've discussed or haven't discussed, let us know in the comments. Until next time, at Liwil Doi Except Noon. Before I go, gratefully acknowledges the financial support of the Indigenous Screen Office.